this morning's plenary is our business plenary, which is the first time that the National Adaptation Forum has held a business plenary. We're very excited to have one this year because the evolution of companies in thinking about climate is also evolving and has moved from really a mitigation focus to adding on to that mitigation focus and adaptation focus, and in sometimes doing those collectively. And by coming to the greater Minneapolis, Twin Cities, Minnesota region, we're lucky enough to have several local companies that are thinking about climate change in the work that they do. This morning's program is a little bit different than originally planned. Greg Page, unfortunately, was unable to make it this morning owing to a family illness, but we are thrilled that our other two panelists have rearranged the whole panel to accommodate this, and we'll be having a lovely little conversation, which I've already gotten a little preview of this morning, and the kind of stuff they're doing is quite interesting. They'll be engaging in a conversation with each other about what each of their companies are doing and learning from each other right in front of you. They were actually holding a pre-panel over there in the front row. And then at the end, if we have questions from the audience, we'll do the same thing we did yesterday in the center. And apparently there's also an opportunity to send questions via Twitter, which I've been told one of our panelists can handle. Is that true? Okay. So without further ado, they're now denying that. Without further ado, I will bring up to the stage Jean Bennington Sweeney is the Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer of 3M. They actually have a booth out in the exhibit space, and we're thrilled to have Jean with us. There's a lot of things that I learned this morning about what 3M does that I did not know. So hopefully you get to learn all of that as well. Otherwise, come visit me later and I'll tell you what I learned. And then our other speaker, who has kindly switched from being the moderator, which is a much lower key task, to being a panelist or discussant, is Raj Rajan, who is wow, suddenly big things appear in front of me, who's the Research Development and Engineering Vice President of Sustainability at Ecolab, which I'm sure if you've walked out of this building, you've seen their big building just a couple blocks away. So please join me in welcoming to the stage, and we'll get to learn more about what they're doing.
When you have only two hands, it's hard to handle a remote for PowerPoint slides and notes. Wonderful to be here. Hopefully you're all enjoying the sumptuous breakfast provided by the Nature Conservancy. Last week I was at a sustainable tourism conference in Cancun, Mexico, and there were a group of people who were into birding that I joined, and we talked about two birds that have something in common between the Yucatan Peninsula, northern Mexico, and Minnesota. One is the Baltimore oriole, which winters in the Yucatan and all over Central America and comes to Minnesota to breed. And the other is sandhill crane, which winters in Florida and northern Mexico and comes on its way up to Alaska and northern Canada, migrates through St. Cloud, Minnesota. And it so happens that we were talking about what triggers their migration back north, or south for that matter. And apparently the Baltimore oriole is triggered by duration of daylight. And the sandhill crane is triggered by ambient temperature. So one is a lot more hardwired better to adapt to climate change. So the big question that we need to ask ourselves, whether it is businesses, communities, or humanity as a whole, is how hardwired are we? Are we going to be the Baltimore oriole, or are we the sandhill crane? So in that tone set by nature that we can follow and make sure that we are better hardwired to adapt to climate change, I want to open up the conversation with a high-level perspective on global risks that the World Economic Forum puts out in Davos. They've been doing it for several years. In the first few years, climate change was identified as a risk. And over the last 2 years, failure to adapt adequately to climate change is what was mapped out as a risk, not climate change per se, but failure to adapt. And so that is a subject that we want to talk about, particularly from the private sector perspective. And the first question often that gets posed is about risk management. And I guess how prepared are businesses not only to adapt to climate change, but to communicate what they are doing to manage risks related to climate change with their investors? Of course, Greg Page would have been a perfect person to answer that because he heads the risk committee of the Risky Business Project. And since he's not there, I'm going to rely on you to kick that off, Jean, about risk management related to adaptation.
Okay, thanks, Raj. And good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. This was the shortest drive I ever had to go to a conference. I live just across the river, so great for me. It's fun to be here. So speaking about risk management, I have the real pleasure at points in time during the year to meet with large investment management firms in New York and Boston. And when these are the kinds of firms that are looking ahead at managing large pension funds. So they're interested in long-term investments. So they're less interested in what's happening day to day or quarter to quarter. But they're more thinking about what's a company going to do to be sustainable or be a good investment in the long term. And the questions I get asked by these firms is typically around what are we doing to manage our environmental impact, to avoid environmental disasters of one type or of another, and then also what are we doing to manage our regulatory risk? What is our culture around meeting our regulatory requirements? And those are questions I always enjoy answering because this is really core to who we are at 3M, that protecting the environment has been very important to us for a very long time. We have very rigorous practices and protocols in place to manage our environmental impact for both water, air, whatever it might be. And then also looking at our regulatory requirements, we do have an expectation of all of our facilities around the globe to be meeting those regulatory requirements. And many times we exceed them because if we believe that those requirements are not fully protective of the environment or fully protective of human health, we will actually act and require facilities to operate at a level above the regulatory requirement. So that's important to us. It's part of our culture. It's part of measuring the success of our manufacturing capability and the performance of our individual employees too. So that's really part of our long-term risk management process, and it's deep into our culture, and it's not something we change on a day-to-day basis that we might otherwise, that many other companies may possibly do.
Great. There's one other specific question that the panelists who were putting together key core questions for this plenary asked us, which is about methodology to quantify risks and benefits of adaptation actions. Are they standardized enough to be useful to financial analysts? It's an interesting question. If you look at it, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board is taken on the monumentous task of standardizing KPIs, metrics that are material to every sector, and ultimately at some point they're going to align this with and have it standardized enough to at least as standardized as the Financial Accounting Standards Board has been. And we know that that has been around for decades, and still in 2008 we found out that there were risks that were not obvious to that framework. So interestingly, as Ecolab, we look at us, we are evolving into an organization that is serving customers across so many sectors that we really don't get, they're not one particular set of standards that would apply. It is particularly when it comes to a subject like climate adaptation, it is so sector specific. So what we do is essentially try to participate in sectors where we can give material input that are relevant to our customers. as opposed to our own business, which is very diverse. And I assume 3M would take the similar approach?
Yeah, we take a very similar approach because, as you mentioned, these standards are typically today being written by sector. And for a company like 3M, where we are in so many sectors, we're best known for our consumer products, a Post-it brand, Scotch tape, Scotch Brite. But that's a kind of the beginning of where we are. But today, we're really a materials manufacturing company, where we manufacture the materials that are used in products that you use every day that make those products work, that you may not even be aware that you're using. In fact, if you're looking at your cell phone right now, chances are there's 3M materials in that phone that make it work. So when we look at all these different products we have across many different industrial sectors, it's difficult for us to fit into those standards by sector. So we're watching that process closely and keeping advised on it to know where it's going. We think it's going to probably someday evolve into something very important. At this point in time, for us to participate, it would be difficult because of the wide range of sectors that we participate in.
Yeah, and already, whether you're looking at the Global Reporting Index or CDP, CDP Water, CDP Climate Change, there are a lot of standardized approaches to reporting on metrics and KPIs that are relevant to all organizations as a baseline, as opposed to some of the sector-specific additional material KPIs.
That's a great point, Raj, because yeah, we do participate in the carbon disclosure product, water, and as you mentioned, and those help us to kind of identify, again, those can work across sector because those aren't sector specific. But we do look at other measurements such as the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, for instance. We have been participating in the DJSI since for the past 17 years. And so that is a great way to measure a company's performance relating to many different sustainability metrics across sectors. And it's also a way that investors use the DJSI to assess sustainability performance and long-term viability of a company by using the DJSI as a benchmark.
Now, DJSI is a great example. We don't have we are relatively new entrants into the DJSI North American Index, and clearly that addresses not just the environmental metrics, but also how innovative are you, and what are your innovation metrics? Well, what about your governance? So a lot more broader scope than the GRI or CDP reporting.
Right, it's very broad scope. In fact, when we complete that survey, it's actually about a 6-month process for us because subject matter experts from every aspect of the company are participating in answering the questions. So we'll answer questions about environmental performance, but also our financial practices, our board of directors, who they are, how they perform, what their expectations are. I mean, it's every single aspect of the corporation that get included in that, and it's a very in-depth and I think a great indicator. We've used it as a benchmarking tool because as the DJSI has evolved, the questions in it have evolved too. And when we see those questions, it gives us an idea of what investors in particular are going to be looking at in the future. And if we can do more to shore that up or to enhance our capability in those areas, it's really helped us lead a little bit further into things that we might not otherwise have done. So it's been very helpful.
So that's the risk management piece, and or as Bill McDonough would like to say, that's a less bad piece as opposed to the more good piece. So let's talk about the more good piece. I mean, when I think of 3M, I'm dating myself here, but when I was when I undergraduate, we were talking about pollution prevention PACE. I mean, 3M literally paved the way for proactive, positive environmental management. And so tell me a little bit about innovation, both in innovative business models and innovative. Do you see a lot of new opportunities related to climate change that adaptation would drive new business opportunities for 3M and your customers?
Well, certainly we do see lots of new business opportunities. We're always looking ahead. Our ability to understand what kinds of problems our customers need to solve in the future. And that can be related to climate change, it can be related to scarcity of materials, it can be related to scarcity of water. human resource issues, we're always looking ahead, well ahead of even where our customers are anticipating. And we're adapting our ability to provide technology and innovation to help our customers solve those problems, in some cases before they even know they have that problem. But that's how we could create competitive advantage, is that foresight and using that foresight into our R&D process to use those 3M technologies to create products and materials that will solve those problems in the future. Because sometimes our customer doesn't even know that they're going to have that problem until they see a solution to it, and it really opens their eyes.
Yeah, Ecolab, if we look at our core business value, we're a business-to-business organization, no consumer products, but we talk about making the world cleaner, safer, and healthier, focused on clean water, safe food, energy abundance, and healthy environments, both healthy built environments and healthy natural environments. And when we look at climate change vulnerabilities, we see food security, we see disease transmission, we see water scarcity. And so we are constantly looking at these vulnerabilities as huge opportunities for us to innovate constantly to emerging threats when it comes to infections and infection transmission, and emerging threats when it comes to particularly vectors like foodborne transmissions. And so how can our food safety offerings, how can our water and sanitation and hygiene offerings, and how can our environmental sanitation offerings tackle these emerging concerns? So we tend to look at our core business value as something that contributes to improving the adaptive capacity of communities through our customers, because we don't have any consumer products per se.
Yes, great.
So another question that comes in terms of looking at long term is, one way to put adaptation business out of business is for mitigation to succeed at the right scale and within the required time frame. And we already know that we have a big challenge there. So another approach is to embed adaptation considerations into routine strategic business planning, like we did with quality and safety. So the question is, are there specific things you're doing to build internal capacity within your organization in this context?
Well, many things that we're doing to build it in. First of all, starting with our strategic planning process, excuse me, every business is expected to have considerations around sustainability in their strategic plan. So it really requires the business to analyze what the customer's challenges are, how our customers are going to be impacted by climate change or any other aspect, and then looking to how we can build that into our planning process to create the technologies for the future that will help solve those problems, or seek new customers, or seek new technologies. So that's embedded in the planning process, which then directs into our R&D process, how we innovate, how we understand what these changes are going to be, and how we can bring technology to bear to help solve those problems or ease that change. So then it gets all the way to the marketing and sales process of really understanding insights from our customers of what those challenges will be in the future. So our ability to adapt is really deep inside our entire strategic planning process, from the very long term to the very short term, and it's core to how we can innovate.
Then there's a question of geographic scale. While a mitigation strategy can be global because of the lack of boundaries when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, much of adaptation is about implementing actions at a local level. Talk a little bit about how you actually translate global strategy in product development and platforms to local implementation that is customized.
Okay, so as a company, we're a global company. We operate in probably, I think, over 100 countries around the world. We're in every region of the world. We have over 120 manufacturing sites around the world. Less than half of them are in the US, and then scattered across many other parts of the world in every region. So when we think about how we're going to adapt and change, and how we're going to modify products based on local markets. So we have a core technology, as I mentioned before, that can be developed, but then we have R&D centers in each region of the world and in many countries that take that technology or that product and will make a modification to that product to the local market. Because not all markets are at the same place in their evolution or in their needs or capabilities. So we have the ability to modify our products to the local needs. For instance, the electrical grid that we use here in the United States isn't the same one that's used in other parts of the world, but the technology can be similar. We provide a number of products that are used in the manufacture or the setup of transmission lines. And those transmission lines can vary in their capability and how they operate in different parts of the world. So our R&D centers in other regions will take the core technology and modify that technology to meet the transmission grid in that region. So it's really a very adaptive kind of approach, and it gives us a real competitive edge because we have the technology and the know-how at the center of the company, and then we can disseminate that to all regions of the world to be modified for the local need.
You bring up a very good point. I'm thinking while you were talking about what we do at Ecolab, we have business in 172 countries, I think, at last count. And it's interesting how we take, I'll give you an example. We take our laundry platform. We have, whether it is on-premise laundry in hotels or commercial laundries. If we're looking at a business in the Asia-Pacific region, laundry machines there, commercial machines, are configured with a lot more rinse cycles, 6 or 7 steps. So we focus a lot, and water is a much scarcer commodity in many of those, particularly in the travel and tourism sector. So we focus a lot on leveraging chemistry and data and automation to deliver water efficiency. And the same laundry platform in Europe, a couple of interesting things, definitely not as water scarce as Asia Pacific is. And also in Europe, because they don't use chlorine bleach, they tend to operate their laundries at higher temperatures to get the sanitation effect. So there we focus on leveraging chemistry, data, and automation to deliver energy efficiency in the laundry platform. So, and that is the customization. The overarching focus is delivering resource efficiency, but it gets customized to regions specific to depending on what the resource bottleneck is. And for the same application platform, based on either culture or availability of resources, particularly in Europe, thermal energy is mostly imported from Russia. So it's a big security long-term concern for businesses there. And so delivering thermal energy efficiency is a much higher priority in Europe, and delivering water efficiency is a much higher priority for the same platform. And so, yeah, that's definitely working in different regions of the world in so many countries. We always have to focus on adapting to the local conditions.
And it creates tremendous competitive advantage.
Yep. There was one other question that was specific to time frames. It's interesting that if you look at time frames for significant investments in natural, human, or social capital, that is pretty long. We're talking in terms of decades. Not that it's unique to the private sector, but if elected officials have to focus on 4-year election cycles, publicly traded corporations have to focus on quarterly financial reporting. So does that become a roadblock to long-term strategic planning because so much of adaptation-related work has to focus on, you look at a lot of the UN and intergovernmental agencies across the world that are talking about projects. They are talking about horizons of 2030 and 2050 for looking at what the outcomes are. What role does that have, for example, particularly about 3M, but in general about the private sector's thinking?
For 3M being, I think we're a 113-year-old company, if we think on the short term, we wouldn't be here anymore. We think the long term because we plan to be around, operating around the world for another 113 years at least, if not more. And so to have that kind of thinking that we want to be servicing our customers on the long run, we can't focus day to day on what we're meeting on the short-term needs. Certainly we do that because it's part of the total picture of how we operate, but we have to have a longer-term view to understand where we're going and what we need to be able to do in the future. Also considering that our R&D process is of a very long cycle time because we're innovating technology that don't exist anywhere else. In order to do that, you just don't do that overnight. And to have that technology to be used in the future, you have to start it somewhere, and start it now, because that's what's going to create really the financial gain and return for the company in the future. So you can't sacrifice the future by focusing only on today. You have to focus on today because there's customers' needs that have to be met today. But we keep in mind the needs of the customer of the future, and what their needs will be is very much in determining ahead of what even the customer knows that they will need in the future. So our ability to foresee that is key to our long-term longevity of our company, and to be able to have the competitive advantage in the future.
Yeah, wow, 114? Wow, we are babies compared to that. Ecolab is 94 years old. We were founded in St. Paul in 1923. And I think about that, the example, what you were talking about in terms of lead time for innovation, I think about that a lot. When I came to Ecolab, one of the things I looked at was the history of innovation around resource use efficiency. And I keep thinking about this one product we launched in 1948. We were 25 years old. We launched a product called Rinseaid in commercial dish machines to reduce the drying time so that you could save on energy use for drying dishes. I thought, wow, 1948, that's 3 decades before we had the quote-unquote energy crunch from the oil embargo. And there have been similar examples over almost a decade before phosphate regulations came in. We voluntarily started phasing down phosphate levels in our cleaning chemistries. And the question has always been asked, if you, from a fiduciary responsibility perspective, why would you do things ahead of or beyond regulations? And the answer has always been that it takes time to turn the Titanic. We have strategic suppliers, all the major chemical manufacturers, Dow, BASF, AkzoNobel, they're all our strategic suppliers, and we have what we call SDI, Strategic Development Initiatives, specifically focused on some very long-term across-platform innovations on raw materials and product formulations, because it takes time to reformulate out of some things, whether it is ozone-depleting substances or cleaning chemicals, sure. And I'm sure.
Although, Raj, we try not to think about it as turning the Titanic. That's the wrong ship. Let's talk about turning the ship, not the Titanic.
There you go, turning a big cruise ship. Yeah, and I just trying to forget I said Titanic. Yeah. Yeah. So no. So another expression that's almost as loaded as saying Titanic, stranded assets. So typically when people talk stranded assets, they talk about the carbon bubble, they talk about oil and gas wells, they talk about coal mines and thermoelectric power plants. From the context of adapting to climate change, the idea of stranded assets, or at least the concept, can go farther into our supply chain and our own operations beyond just these sectors, right? Any thoughts on that? That's a question that was posed.
Great question. As part of operating in 100 plus countries around the world and manufacturing sites across all of the regions, we're constantly evaluating where we're operating, what the future will be, because markets shift, markets from developing market to developed market. And we want to be early, but sometimes you can be too early. And sometimes you were in a location or a particular technology in a manufacturing plant that the technology has shifted, the needs have changed, and that technology is no longer a vital technology for our portfolio. So we do have manufacturing facilities that at one time or another can become less adaptive, and so therefore we make changes. So we're constantly evaluating where we're located, what assets we need in that location, what technologies we're going to bring in, and watching to see how the shifts happen and to know where we need to be and anticipating those needs. At the same time, evaluating, is it time to consolidate facilities together? Is it time to close a facility because it's no longer viable in that market? or can we import from another region of the world? So that's a continual process. It's something we're doing all the time, constantly evaluating our footprint, manufacturing footprint in particular, so that we're always contemporary and always in advance of the needs of the local market.
Yeah, we tend to look at it a lot more focused on our customers. Is there a potential for our customers' assets to be stranded? And if so, what can we do to proactively preempt that? And I think a lot of that focus is help. It's actually, we get good direction from reporting frameworks like CDP, where they specifically ask how much of your supply chain sourcing of materials comes from water stress areas, for example, or how much of your manufacturing is in water stress areas. We take that one step further and say how many of our customers who are in water intensive industries are operating in regions that are water stressed. What can we do? In fact, one of the things we did when we launched the water risk monetizer tool in the public domain, the focus was really that, is to help our customers and our suppliers map out their businesses related to water so that they can get most bang for the buck focused on regions where they can mitigate potential adverse impacts in the long run. And another subject that is talked about more across the Atlantic is the subject of sustainable consumption. What role do we as producers have in sustainable consumption? And a couple of thoughts that come to my mind when I hear that expression is a couple of decades ago, most major auto manufacturers were saying, if India and China, not if, when India and China can afford it, we want every home to have 3 automobiles just like we do here, or 2. And we still hear that sometimes in the food and beverage sector, agriculture, agribusiness, that when India and China can afford it, they're going to be eating like we are in terms of more animal protein consumption and everything. Is that the right kind of thinking, or is there another layer here? Not everybody wants to look like us if they can. And what role do we as businesses have shaping sustainable consumption as consumers of raw materials, shaping our suppliers, or even shaping marketplaces in terms of what our customers might want? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we're going to see other markets adapt more quickly than we have in the U.S. And I think it's a little presumptuous for Americans to think the rest of the world all wants to look like us. And I kind of hope that they're thinking beyond that. Yeah. So when we look ahead, and we're really anticipating what, again, happening in a local market, but a great example is when China as a country began to have telephone capability, they didn't build in an entire infrastructure of telephone poles all around the country. That just wasn't possible. But the technology existed for mobile phones. So they jumped over the traditional technology that we started with as a country and went directly to cell phones. So they didn't have to make that large investment. Instead, they invested in the cell phone towers and that technology. So I wouldn't want to assume that other countries are going to look just like us, because I think that we're going to see a jumping ahead and advancing a technology and not going through the same progression that we did, because there's going to be so much capability and opportunity that they have that we didn't, because we've progressed it step by step.
Yeah, that is the cultural component. We were talking about this earlier that you brought up is so critical. And there's also the leapfrogging piece. I think even in transportation, countries that did not invest in personal transportation infrastructure like we did in terms of roads are able to leapfrog and invest more in mass transit. So in terms of being able to adapt. Now, that definitely is the case, that not all the world wants to look like us if they can. I think I will do one last question, and then we can open the floor up to questions from the audience. This has to do with, you look at this room, we have academics, government officials, community leaders, NGOs, business owners. There is a lot that needs to be done, not just within our own fences, but as public-private partnerships. Examples of that in this context, in the context of climate change and adaptation?
Yes, we have many public-private partnerships. In fact, one partnership that we're very proud of is our relationship with the Nature Conservancy. You mentioned them at the beginning. We have been funding the Nature Conservancy through the 3M Foundation for over 20 years and have donated more than $21 million. That's important to us because our natural environment is the source of materials, but it's also a source of human health. And we need to be a part of making sure that those high conservation values in areas of the world are protected, because our ability as a human race is dependent on that, as are all not just the human race, but all plants and animals. So we really think that the Nature Conservancy does a great job of partnering with businesses and using business and technology to be able to help solve some of those difficult challenges in areas of conservation that we see around the world. And it's a great partnership. It's been very beneficial to both sides, I think, over a long term.
It's a great example. Ecolab, a couple of years ago, got involved with, particularly focused on natural capital investment related to water quality. And TNC was the ideal partner there in terms of affecting land use that has water quality implications. And the Mississippi River Headwaters Fund came out of that, and Ecolab was an early investor in that, because the way I look at it, technology, which by that I mean chemistry and concrete and steel, can make water drinkable, water fit for purpose, whatever the purpose might be, whether it is for human consumption or industrial commercial use. But the challenge is ambient water quality, and often gray infrastructure cannot deliver that outcome. So our water might be perfectly drinkable, particularly, and I don't say if, when we solve the challenge of clean energy, we will solve the off-stream use component of water, because we can use all the energy we want if it doesn't have negative environmental impact. But what we will not solve is the in-stream use, the ecosystem services, the natural capital, the fishable and swimmable, the cultural and quality of life components, and the biodiversity components. And there, relying on public entities like TNC or World Wildlife Fund, we worked with WWF on the Alliance for Water Stewardship, again recognizing that so much of the things, particularly around water, which a lot of Ecolab's business depends on, cannot be achieved by just doing stuff inside the fence. You have to collaborate with people within the watershed.
I'll add on to that with a more specific example. We've been looking very carefully at our practices of how we source pulp and paper. So how we have paper in many of our products, not just Post-it notes. And we're very concerned about deforestation around the world and how we play a role for responsible forest management. So 2 years ago, we wrote implemented our pulp and paper sourcing policy. And in our policy, we're very explicit about protecting high conservation value forests, intact forest lands, and protection of the rights of indigenous people who make a living, who earn their living in those forests. So because we're not a forestry company, that's not our core competency, we went to who we believed is core in understanding forests, and it was the Nature Conservancy. Went to their experts, their forestry experts, to really help us understand issues around forestry and what does responsible forest management really mean. And I learned a great deal in that process, and the experts are really very willing to share their information and really taught me a lot about what does a high conservation value mean, what are the regions of the world that are at most risk, where we could and should consider operating and sourcing from. So we built that into our policy, and now we're working with another NGO, the Forest Trust, who's working with us to actually implement the policy with our suppliers. So we determine who our suppliers are. The Forest Trust will work with the supplier to help the supplier understand what our requirements are and actually audit them and also train them, so capacity building. So really to enhance our ability to know that the pulp and paper that we're sourcing does come from a responsible source. And we're not just setting that requirement out and say, you guys figure it out. We're actually partnering with the Forest Trust to teach our suppliers and help them improve their practices so that we can do something that's better for all the world and not just for our suppliers.
That's a great example of it. The education component is such a critical piece, and I'm reminded of 2 years ago, about the same time we started working with the TNC, we worked with this organization called Project WET out of Montana, Water Education for Teachers, and the idea there was actually to get our employees engaged in something that they do as their day job, to take that to the K through 12 school system and work with partners. So in Minnesota, the MPCA, Pollution Control Agency, is the official channel for Project WEC to communicate it. And we developed curriculum that is focused all the way from kindergarten to play activities and gaming and all the way through high school. Teachers aid, training aid, and other things that get communicated in the context of water, sanitation, and hygiene. And that education component, whether it is working with diverse suppliers or whether it is working with consumers, is such a critical component in the long run, because that's another way for us to help shape the marketplace for raw materials and for finished goods. So do we have time for questions?
Yep, we absolutely do.
So
If
why don't we
anyone
open the
has-
floor up?
Come on up here. We have the mic set up. They might almost be able to see you.
Hi, I'm Michael Simpson from the Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience. Raj, you talked about what was the role of producers to impact consumption. I'm going to ask, what is the role for industrialists like you to lead and provide guidance to the majority of the businesses in the United States, which are small and very small businesses, not large corporations? I know you can influence them up your supply chain, but what is the role for your thinking, and how do you translate that down to the business entities that the majority of the employers in the United States are, which are 500 employees or less? They don't have the R&D funds you have.
That's a great question, and I'll give you a couple of examples of things we have done. The ability to constantly think about the rising tide lifting all boats is very important. You're absolutely right. Not every organization is a 3M or a Cargill or an Ecolab. And one thing we do is work with industry groups. So the World Travel and Tourism Council, for example, they have a sustainability working group, environmental working group. Work with them on sharing best practices. Another great example is the beverage industry environmental roundtable. When it was founded about a decade ago, we got involved very early on, working with our competitors and our peers and our customers and our prospects to share best practices. And I think that piece of it is very critical, so that it percolates across all sizes of organizations within each sector. And a lot of that is very sector specific. And another piece is also in terms of expectations of investors and transparency. We get involved, for example, when the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board started developing KPIs and metrics for all sectors. We were actually involved in committees to review those and help shape those, because that is used by big businesses and small businesses across the board. So those are a couple of examples. Clearly, we have to be very involved in both cross-sector collaboration and collaboration within the sector that goes beyond the big players in each sector. Any thoughts you want to add to that, Jane?
One thing I will add is that a relationship that we're now developing with an organization called World Skills. And in US, it's Skills USA. This is an organization that's encouraging and developing the capability for young people to recognize skilled trades as something that is an opportunity for a career. This would be electricians, it would be the basic skilled carpenters, skilled trades, because we find in our own manufacturing facilities that there's a shortage of the skilled trades that we need to make sure our equipment runs correctly every day, day after day. And our ability to hire them with those skills is, we can do that, but they're not available because young people are making other choices and not recognizing the skilled trades as an opportunity. So we have relationships going with a number of organizations, including World Skills, which is just particularly focused at encouraging young people and developing the curriculums in the schools to create those opportunities so that people recognize that that's something that they can do. That would be a really meaningful career, and one that'll be financially viable and can really grow them as a person. So that's another partnership that's really helping us that would not only benefits us, but benefits all industries, large and small. because everyone is experiencing that same shortage.
And some of the innovations, some of the most game-changing innovations come from the smaller organizations. Think about the brewing sector, for example. I believe there are like 120 microbreweries in Minnesota. And you look at what happened in the brew sector, there's a lot of transformational practices to drive resource use efficiency that came from the microbreweries and the craft brewers, that if you look at the beverage industry environmental roundtable, they might account for 80+% of the volume of beverages sold worldwide. But bringing in, that's a bi-directional thing in terms of engagement. It's not just communicating best practices from big organizations to small, it's also in the other direction.
Marjorie Brands from the School for Social Entrepreneurs, Ontario. My question is about the investors. You talked earlier about institutional investors becoming far more risk savvy, like the pension funds. They're a small minority of investors. I mean, most investors are still focused on quarterly returns. So I'm wondering what the role is of corporations like yours that do accept investment to begin to educate investors about these longer term risks. And I'll just note that Unilever has just disposed of all quarterly returns.
You want to take that, Jean?
No?
One comment, right? Interestingly, Ecolab, I believe we are like 80 or 85% institutional investors who tend to think, like pension funds and stuff, that they tend to think in the very, very long term. But yes, we cannot escape the fact that we have to cater to meeting the expectations of long-term institutional investors and short-term investors. That there's no question about it. And we tackle both those perspectives all the time.
And we do too. But I would also suggest that long-term investors may be smaller in number, but the dollar value is much greater than short-term investment. Much, much greater by many factors. So, but as a corporation like us, I've mentioned before, we have to pay attention to both, you know, because both are important investors to us. The short-term investor and the long-term investor, it's a whole community, and we need to be successful with all of them. It's not just one or the other. And we do quarterly earnings calls. We do a quarterly financial report. We will continue to do that. It's part of who we are. It's part of being transparent. It's part of being open with our investors about how things are going, what's happening, what we see coming in the future. So I really don't see that changing.
And there are organizations like Ceres who are putting out a lot of sector-specific guidance documents for investors, for them to help understand what are the potential long-term environmental or climate change implications and risks related to different sectors. So those are good. That's good guidance that's out there for investors of all shades.
Hi, good morning. My name's Colin Wellencamp. I'm the executive director of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. We're an association of United States mayors from Bemidji, Minnesota, all the way to New Orleans. And the mayor of St. Paul and the mayor of Gretna, Louisiana are our current co-chairs. I appreciate your conversations about partnerships and the value of partnerships and reaching out to other organizations, especially the effort to keep the headwaters of the Mississippi River pristine. We reached out to both of your organizations to partner with us on keeping the water, all of the water in the Mississippi River in all 10 states clean. 50 cities use that water every day to drink. 20 million people, including my little 4-year-old girl, drink that water every day, as does the granddaughter of the mayor of Cape Girardeau and all the other mayors and their families up and down the Mississippi River. Both of your organizations said no thank you. So this is me making another crack at the bat to you. The mayors of the Mississippi River, our association, would like to partner with both of your organizations to improve the water quality of that waterway. It is the basis of our entire existence. Not only are we drinking that water, it is the support of our manufacturing economy. Manufacturing pulls 85 billion gallons of fresh water out of the Mississippi River every day, and it is also the #1 pull supporting our tourism economy, and it supports our agricultural economy. So we've got about 1 million jobs depending on the water quality of that waterway. And we both, all of us on the river, would love to work with both of your organizations. So I'm asking one more time, can we work with you on improving the water quality of the Mississippi River? And how do we do that? How can we partner with you to do this?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. We'll take that back within to our organizations and definitely look
Sure,
forward
we'll
to
take
it.
another look at it. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Good morning. I'm Jessica Hellman. I'm at the University of Minnesota. I'm trying to wrap my head around the private sector and climate change adaptation. I'm wondering if you could share with us either a specific example from each of your experiences, or maybe it's forward-looking and you haven't tackled this yet, but more than just sustainability or water use efficiency, what about your customers or municipalities, other clients that you're working with who are confronting natural disasters, extreme events, heavy precipitation, drought, that are dealing with climate change risks? What are specific products or places or people that your private sector interests could benefit and help them mitigate those risks?
Jessica, good question. One particular area we focused on in terms of disruptions that come from extreme weather events related to climate change is enabling our customers, particularly our heavy industrial customers, to use poorer water quality without additional treatment for the processes, utility water use within their industries, because we can get wild swings in water quality associated with extreme weather events, and we don't want to disrupt the businesses, and we don't want them to incur significantly higher costs associated with their operations. So a lot of our focus, and it's from a tactical perspective, it helps to adapt to those transitional changes in water quality. From a strategic perspective, in the long run, it will enable our customers to reuse more of their water, which means rely less on fresh water that's available in the watershed and that they can share with other competing users. So that is one example of things that we are doing. Is we have a platform, technology platform that it's called 3D Tracer, which is a fluorescent dye-based feedback control automation for conditioning, whether it is corrosion inhibition, scale inhibition, or quality-related water use for pulp and paper, iron and steel, or any other manufacturing, where we have this dynamic feedback control that with 24/7 monitoring, with data stored in the cloud, and relying on big data infrastructure, and really having a very dynamic, responsive system to adapt to variations, which is one of the big things that is the result of extreme weather or other events that are triggered by climate change.
Similar process, we have a variety of technologies that can, for instance, in the home, for clean air and clean water. We have water filtration products, units that you can install underneath your sink that will purify water, filter water as it comes into your home to use for drinking water and for cooking. We also have air filtration systems, filters that you use on your furnace to help clean the air to create a healthier environment in your home. We use those same technologies in large manufacturing scale operations too, to clean air and to clean water. So there's in addition to that, I'll go into an energy efficiency. We have a number of products that help to, for instance, reduce the energy load in a building. The 3M window film, it's a film that's placed on a window, on windows of a large building, for instance, that actually reflects heat, but allows the light in. And that reduces the cooling load on a building, and a large building. It can also be used on your home. Maybe some of you do have Scotch 3M window film in your home. But it helps to cool the home, reduce the energy load. So it's an energy efficiency application. Same kinds of film is used actually on cars to reduce the heat and light that comes into a car body. So therefore, less energy spent on cooling the car. So there are many different technologies that we use for adaptation around a lot of those different issues, both in manufacturing in large-scale environments and in the home.
Good morning. I'm Brian Ambrette from the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy in Maryland, and thank you for this conversation this morning. I wish some of our elected leaders might be able to hear this and see how seriously our corporations are taking climate change and adaptation in this country and might change some of their minds. My question has to do with your workforces and how you see climate change impacting the people who work for your companies, and in particular where you might be making investments in the public arena to improve their lives and their abilities to be good employees for you all.
Well, I mentioned previously our relationship with WorldSkills and ability to increase skilled trades. So that's providing people the capability to meet the changing demands of manufacturing and manufacturing jobs, so we have the right skill force to be able to do that. I think that that's just kind of tipping the iceberg of all the different opportunities that can exist of how we need to adapt our workforce. We also look to diversity. We're very concerned about our ability to hire not only diverse employees, but also with the right education background for managing our technologies and our creativity and innovation process. So diversity is really important to us because we know that a diverse group of employees that can look at a problem will have different thoughts of how to approach a problem, and a variety of ideas can have a much greater success long-term of solving those problems and coming up with really creative and innovative solutions. So we're concerned about our workforce, the availability of the talent and skills that we need, and also the availability of the diversity that we need.
Yeah, and beyond the diversity piece, we also think about, particularly when we are operating in so many regions of the world, the mobility of talent. And our CEO always talks about how important open borders with respect to talent mobility is, irrespective of how the political winds blow. We as major multinational corporations, have a very open attitude towards the global talent pool, and we want to attract the best and brightest within our organizations and into the areas where and we recognize that there are going to be climate change driven movement of peoples, and like all other changes that we are constantly adapting to, whether it is social, political, or other factors, the mega trends in different regions of the world that drive changes. Climate change is one of them. And since we are constantly monitoring changes around the world and adapting to them, it is a natural part of our process in different regions of the world. The strategies are different, but clearly the mobility of talent is something that we support very strongly.
I think we're out of time.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the audience for your questions. I apologize that there was one tweeted question that I actually figured out how to access, and then we didn't have time to ask. So the next session begins at 9:10, so you have 10 minutes to get there. Grab a cup of coffee on the way, and have another great day at the forum. Again, thank you to our two speakers.